And welcome to the special edition of Hannity. Now, for the next hour, we're going to be taking a close look at the business of government in Washington, D.C., and how it is making a lot of people very rich with your hard-earned money. Now, we sent author Peter Schweitzer to our nation's capital to take us inside this new American boomtown. Take a look.
Washington, D.C., the nation's capital, the seat of federal power, and increasingly a town that is very rich. The local Native Americans named the river Potomac, which means where goods are offloaded or where tribute is paid. Today, that tribute comes in the form of trillions of dollars of taxpayer money that floods into this city every year. While 1 out of every 6 Americans worries about where their next meal is coming from, Washington, D.C. has the highest rate of fine wine consumption in the United States. While 1 out of 4 Americans has a mortgage that is underwater, 7 of the 10 wealthiest counties in the United States are counties around this region. Washington, D.C. now has the highest per capita income in the entire United States. They just passed Silicon Valley. You're going to discover that Washington, D.C., a town that used to be a town of sleepy bureaucrats, is now a town of Maserati dealerships, fine wines, luxurious homes, and luxurious shops. It's a Washington, D.C. that a lot of people never see when they take their tours or they go to the museums. But it's the Washington, D.C. that reflects the reality of our country today. The great American writer F. Scott Fitzgerald once wrote that the rich are different from you and me. America's previous boomtowns became wealthy because they produced something. San Francisco during the gold rush, Abilene, Texas, cattle, and of course Detroit during the heyday of the American automobile. All of those boomtowns became very wealthy in their time because they created something new. This boomtown, its wealth comes from extracting it from the rest of the country. Boomtown is something that no one in Washington wants to talk about. When they do, they tend to blame the other side. But the reality is today that in Washington, D.C., the business is not politics, the business is money.
And joining us now, Peter Schweitzer and filmmaker Steve Bannon. Great work, good to see you. We're gonna really open up a can of worms here tonight.
Yeah.
All right, so Washington, D.C., 3 of the wealthiest counties in the country, 7 of the top 10?
Yes, that's right. That's right. And this is the thing that people don't realize about Washington, D.C. We think of it as the seat of federal power. Politics reigns supreme, but it's a business. There's a business model there. And really what exists is what we call the permanent political class. We think of Republicans and Democrats, and there are philosophical differences, but at the end of the day, they're all primarily looking for a way to make money. And you don't make money by shrinking government, you make money by growing government.
You know, you made some comparisons. 1 in 6 Americans in poverty, 1 in 4 Americans, their mortgages are underwater, meaning they can't even get their way out of their house without losing.
This is the great unreported story of our time right now, because this is extraction. The rest of the country is in a financial and economic crisis. Much of the country is almost in a depression. And yet you have Washington with the 3 richest counties bordering it, 7 of the top 10. The big number, per capita income, is now higher than Silicon Valley, the great technology engine of the United States. It's the 4th city generating millionaires.
No,
if you look at every
fourth fastest city.
Fastest. If you look at every statistic about people and incomes, Washington, D.C., and the reason is because you have a massive federal budget that gets allocated through there.
Well, and it goes a little bit deeper, Steve, and you're right on all of these points, and those statistics should wake people up. But isn't it, a lot of this is built in? It's like a pyramid scheme, because they have baseline budgeting. Every budget, every area of government goes up 6, 7, 8% a year, even though we're still borrowing nearly 50 cents of every dollar they spend.
That's right. And Sean, what's interesting is it's not only the allocation of federal dollars, but there's a lot of money that comes into Washington to determine how that money is going to be allocated. So you've got taxpayer money, you've got special interests putting money in Washington, D.C. to influence the process, to steer money in their way. It is a town awash with cash. And the sad reality is that it's only going to get worse. It's not going to get better.
One of the arguments that I have made as the president has so successfully used the class warfare arguments as he has, it's interesting. It seems that the politicians are the ones that are greedy, selfish, power hungry. They build up their power by granting people government programs, spending other people's money. How come they've never got tagged as being greedy and selfish as they now steal from our kids' piggy banks?
I think no one's ever turned the camera on them. I think that's what we intend to do. We're going to look at this, and this is a bipartisan problem. This is just not a beat down on Democrats, although they are the party of big government. This is a permanent political class that has now kind of formed an aristocracy. And that aristocracy, that's why nothing changes in Washington. That's why you have these budget debates. And like you said, you're talking about cuts in growth rates of budgets, not cut in the budget itself. It's not a downside. They never cut it. And the reason, as you can tell, they've really extracted money through taxes and then the ability to borrow for their lifestyles. In addition, there's no pressure on them to really cut. They really control Wall Street. It's not the money controls Washington. Washington controls the money. They have an industrial logic to this business model, just like any other business model, and that is to extract power from the rest of the country and money into a centralized location, which is Washington.
You know, you mentioned in your piece, Peter, about Maserati dealerships and fine wines and expensive restaurants and the home prices, et cetera. Yeah. Are these government employees that are buying the Maseratis?
It's probably not government employees. It's people that influence government policies. So it's people like lobbyists, people that are in government relations, people that run contracting firms who really their businesses whose only client or only customer is the federal government. So it's money that gets sloshed around in all those different ways. And the reality is that, you know, I lived in Washington, D.C. in the 1980s. It was really kind of a middle-class town with some wealthy areas. It's a completely different place now. And part of it is the size of the federal budget has grown enormously, and of course they take the cut of everything that comes out. So,
and what are they producing? You're right. We talked about an oil boom, gold rush, cattle, et cetera, and all these other. They've produced something. What is Washington producing except record debts, record deficits, and telling old people we're gonna means test your Social Security. We're gonna raise the retirement age to about 1 hour before you die, so you'll get at least an hour's worth of what you've paid into your whole life.
Well, that's it. The whole point. They have a business model. That business model is government, and it's bigger government. And as long as they have the ability to borrow, right? As long as they can take tax receipts and borrow, they're going to continue to do that. And so that's why you're seeing now we're trying to put the camera on this business model, let you see the lifestyles of the rich and powerful.
We have a lot more to get to tonight. Guys, stay right there. Coming up, the ballooning federal budget has doubled in the past 10 years, but you'll be astounded to see where that money is actually coming from and where it's going. That and much more on this special edition of Hannity. And welcome back to the special edition of Hannity Boomtown. Now, along with the monuments, the tourist attractions, visitors to D.C. will see something else when they visit the Capitol these days: construction, and a lot of it. Now, the city and its surrounding suburbs, they don't seem to be experiencing the long, sluggish, so-called recovery that the rest of America is now enduring. In Washington, business is booming. Watch this.
They tearing up this whole area. After, what, let's say 70, 80 years, they're ready to put something new.
Washington, D.C. is a boom town because this town is literally flooded with money. And a lot of that is borrowed money. You see, the federal budget was about $2 trillion a decade ago. Today, it's close to $4 trillion. And that money goes for things like national defense and social welfare programs, but it also stays right here. You see, the federal government in the Washington, D.C. area employs 245,000 people, and the pay and compensation is very good. The average pay and compensation is about $120,000 a year. And those individuals get paid to do all sorts of things. In the parallel universe that is Washington, D.C., even the fact that this is borrowed money, that we're going into debt, creates a job opportunity. There's a federal agency called the Bureau of the Public Debt that actually is hiring people right now to help cope with the money that we're spending that we cannot afford to pay for. But the problem goes beyond federal employees because you see, in addition to federal employees, there are legions of government contractors and government contracting firms that spend time and spend a lot of money here in Washington, D.C. In fact, under President Bush, that reached some years up to $400 billion being spent to private contractors. Indeed, over the past decade, we're talking about trillions of dollars that are going to private companies or to contract firms whose client is the federal government. Now, Washington, D.C. is a new boomtown, but it's also a town that faces a lot of income inequality. You see, while there are people that are getting very, very rich off the influx of taxpayer money into this town, there is also an underclass in this city. In fact, Washington, D.C. ranks third in the entire country when it comes to income inequality. So this is a town that has its rich, but it also has its poor.
And we continue with Peter Schweitzer and Stephen Bannon. Now, that's an interesting ending to this segment here because a lot of poor people in Washington, the government's, and in some cases right around the block from where a lot of these big monuments, a lot of these tourist attractions are. How could that happen when 15% of every dollar that they spend is spent in and around Washington?
That's a great question, Sean, and I mean, that's the irony here. You would think that if the egalitarian vision had any place that it succeeded, it would be Washington, D.C., because they have all this money pouring in. But the reality is that in Washington, D.C., really what matters in a lot of cases is connections, relationships, and if you're not in that closed circle, you are not going to get access to the funds.
Yeah, you would think that these people that have a monopoly on compassion, Steve, would just look around them in some of these neighborhoods, and I've been to many of them, and they're struggling, and people are starving, and their kids need food stamps to feed themselves.
It's unacceptable. Also, if you look at that statistic that we had on the screen, that the top 20% or the top 5% is making $475,000 a year. I mean, of all the 50 wealthiest cities in the country, it's the top as far as that concentration of wealth. And so I think a compassion is all happy talk. I think when you look at actually where the money's spent, how the money's spent, and who the money's spent on, you see you have a political class there that's really just concerned about themselves.
You pointed out, too, Peter, that we've doubled the amount of money that Washington is spending in a decade.
Right.
From $2 trillion to just shy of $4 trillion a year, and we'll probably surpass that this year or next. You know what's interesting about that? We take in only $2.2 trillion.
Right.
So if we would have lived within our means, if they didn't grow government just in the last 10 years, we'd be in a lot better shape.
Yeah, no, absolutely we would. And that's what is really troubling about this. Not only is Washington, D.C. becoming sort of this new Versailles that reminds you of, France under royalty, but they're doing it on borrowed money. It's not just a question of them taking tax revenue. They're actually borrowing money, and it's going into Washington, D.C. And, the reality is that, look, there are no incentives in Washington, D.C. to cut the size of government.
They're not going to do it.
There's no money to be made. Yeah. And they live in this sort of artificial creation or bubble that is different from the rest of the country.
It's like having a $4 trillion private equity fund every year. The entire GDP of the entire U.S. economy is about $16 trillion. This is about 25% of the economy. We're not making the argument it's all spent in Washington, but it's all controlled coming through Washington every year. That's why there's no incentive to ever cut anything. These guys are the beneficiary of that $4 trillion.
Where is a sense of patriotism, duty, responsibility to future generations? You say there's no incentive. I thought they're supposed to serve the public. And when you have to rob our children of 46 cents of every dollar we're spending now, I would think there's got to be some.
The way the founders looked at Washington and the way it used to be a generation ago is people would come to Washington, and public service was really, they were walking away from businesses. They would come for a period of time. They would serve in the executive branch, whether they were Republicans or Democrats. People would come and serve in Congress and then go home. Today, that's what I'm talking about extraction. When Peter and I talk about that, it's just not extracting tax revenues. You're getting the best and the brightest in the country starting to come to Washington because they see a career. They see a way to make a career. And the reason is when you have the ability to allocate $4 trillion every year and it's increasing.
How much political patronage?
It's influence peddling. It's like Tammany Hall. And that's what, by the way, it's happened in America before. It's happening now, and this is
never happened like this.
Not this scale. You're correct. And by the way, this is a crisis because you do not have the political will in Washington to change it.
If the media did a little bit of their job, they would be covering this as well, but they don't. All right, stay right there. We're going to come back. Still to come, members of Congress, they love to brag about their family values, but coming up next, we're going to tell you about the family values they don't want you to know about and why it pays very well to be born into the right family. Stay with us as this special edition of Hannity, Boomtown, continues.